I'm really excited for our next speaker. She's spoken for us before, and LaJean is a senior researcher, senior historian at the Church History Library, and I'm going to give her all the time she needs, so I'm going to just turn it over to LaJean.
On October 6, 1867, the saints met in the Salt Lake City Tabernacle for the first time, our current tabernacle. Brigham Young rose, made some remarks about the still unfinished state of the organ, and then dedicated the tabernacle to the Lord. This dedicatory prayer was completely unknown until I found the original shorthand record of it several years ago and transcribed it. Prior to that time, the earliest known dedication of the tabernacle was 1875. I will read the very start of his dedicatory prayer. The entire prayer is available online at history.churchofjesuschrist.org. Quote, "O God, our Heavenly Father, who dwells in the heavens, in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ, we come before thee at this time to worship thee. On this occasion, we ask for the aid of thy Holy Spirit to teach us how to pray, what we should ask for, and how to ask that we may receive." End quote. This and other prayers by Brigham Young tell us a lot about the man. In prayer, the line of the Lord was a humble, pleading servant. I have at times followed his example and prayed to know how to pray, what to ask for, and how to pray that I may receive. I am a professional transcriber of 19th and early 20th century documents written in Pittman and Taylor shorthands at the Church History Library, Salt Lake City. I have spent much of my career transcribing the words of Brigham Young. Last year at Fair, I presented how the words spoken by Brigham Young and others were often significantly altered in transcription and editing. The versions of these words that were published in the Journal of Discourses, the Deseret News, and Lineal Star often differ significantly from what was really said. These changes incorrectly warp readers' opinions of Brigham Young and others. Brigham Young, as he really spoke, was a much more powerful speaker and a much kinder, more understanding and thoughtful man than he has come to be seen through sermons which have been altered, edited, and changed in many ways. In addition to these changes, many of the sermons spoken by Brigham Young and others were reported in Pittman's shorthand but never transcribed until I transcribed them, most over 150 years after they were spoken and recorded. These previously untranscribed sermons by Brigham Young include many statements that he made about himself, his life, his conversion, and his faith. Today, I will present Brigham Young through his own words that were not transcribed, or in a very, very few cases, transcribed incorrectly. All quotes in this paper are from my transcriptions of the original shorthand record. Hear what Brigham Young said about Brigham Young in his own words. Brigham Young grew up in a very strict, very poor home. Quote, "After I was 23 years old, I had 11 days of education. I was brought up in the woods. My father wanted to be wealthy and was plowing the new countries to make himself wealth. My father never bought me but one hat from the world, and it cost him $1. I do not think my father ever furnished me more than 2 or 3 pairs of shoes in his life." End quote. At that time, children, or the labor of children, belonged to the parents until they were 21 years old. Brigham Young's father told him when he was 16 that he could have his time, that is, he could leave and support himself, which he did from that age on, learning many things in the process. Quote, "I went to school 11 days, the most school I ever had. But from that time I was 16 years old, I clothed and fed myself. I have been in the School of Economy since I was 16, end quote. He worked hard and took pride in the very high quality of his work. His conversion. Brigham Young searched many, many years, from his youth up, to find a church whose teachings and practices agreed with the Bible, but was unable to find one. He was finally convinced that there was not a Bible church or a Bible Christian on the earth. Quote, long before Joseph Smith published the gospel, I had lived long enough to learn that the whole sectarian world was ignorant, was in darkness, if they were not in unbelief, but I suppose they were. They were in ignorance. They didn't know God and Jesus. I was skeptical with regard to the religions of the day, end quote. He learned about the gold plates from a newspaper article shortly after Moroni's first visit to Joseph Smith. Quote, 4 years before Joseph Smith obtained the plates, I picked up a newspaper and there read, "There is a young man living in the town of Manchester, Ontario County, that has found plates in the earth. He says it is a history of the Aborigines of our country, giving details of the forefathers of the Indians now living here. And who knows but what our Indians will have a Bible as well as the Jews." And that is all that was said, end quote. He had been disappointed so many times in his search for a Bible church that he was very skeptical at first. But he was interested enough to follow the travels and activities of Joseph Smith through the years. Quote, "Although I was not a member of the church until it was 2 years old, yet I knew very well about Joseph Smith before he organized the church. Brother Kimball and I only lived 14 miles from where the plates were taken from the ground. We could hear the doings of this about travels to Pennsylvania, over to New York State, and back to Palmyra and so forth. And we had the history of the young man all the time. And in 1830, immediately after the organization of the church, the brethren began to preach. I recollect my father and myself early took it into our hearts that we would go and hear Elder Cowdery preach. I turned to look for my horse to get up a little wagon Sunday morning, but I found my horse was lame, that we could not go. Some circumstance transpired that we didn't go. If only we had seen Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith, as soon as the church was organized, and known or seen any person who had explained to us and given us the reason of hope then, though I expect we should have embraced the faith as we did, when we did," end quote. We can hear the longing in his voice. If only. He heard others talk about their efforts to get the gold plates from the hill before Joseph Smith obtained them. Quote, "I knew one astrologer. I heard him say when Joseph was looking for the Book of Mormon, they was in the hill, and a number of men knew there was a treasure. They sent for this astrologer. He was the smartest one I ever saw. He went up the last time there. The last he goes on the 1st of September, a few days before Joseph got the plates. He came into David Smith's store. I was there when he came in. He commenced swearing about this loot and damned him and said, 'I believe he will get the treasure. I cannot get it.' They flee away from me. This is the 3rd time I've been there, and I cannot go to the spot, and I cannot get it," end quote. Brigham Young said he had a copy of the Book of Mormon in his hands shortly after its publication in March 1830. Quote, "When the Book of Mormon was first printed, I had it in my hands 2-3 weeks after. Did I believe, though the man that brought it to me told me, 'This is the gospel of salvation, revelation the Lord has brought forth for the redemption of Israel, the gospel according to Jesus Christ and apostles?' Hold on, says I. Wait a little while. What is the doctrine of the book and of the revelations the Lord has given? Let me apply to my heart to them, and after I have done this, it is my right to know for myself. It took me 2 years before I made up my mind to receive that book. I knew it was true, as well as I believed the sight of my eyes, the touch of my finger, and of my senses," end quote. He was introduced to the gospel by men who were not learned, but who brought the power of God. Quote, "I praised Christ, but disbelieved the religions of the day and thought their practice was all folly and nonsense. When I heard the gospel, men came to our neighborhood. They could not quote half-dozen passages of scriptures. They could not talk longer than every brother here today, some 3 minutes, some 11, 13, and 9. But they brought the power of God with them, and the Holy Ghost spoke through them, and spoke to my heart." End quote. He used his experience with the Book of Mormon to encourage the saints to ask God to know if things were true. Quote, "When the Book of Mormon came to me, when the revelations came to me, when witnesses came and declared that Joseph Smith was a prophet, seer, and revelator, and those bore their testimony, the revelations, neither the Book of Mormon, was testimony to me until I got the revelations for myself that it was true and of God. Upon this grand principle, men and women are capable of judging the things of God and the things that are not of him." End quote. Like many new converts, Brigham Young had very high expectations for other members of the church. And like many new converts and longtime members, he was deeply disappointed in the behavior of other church members. Quote, "When I received the spirit of this religion that we have embraced, that so far enveloped me in love, purity, good thought, and good feelings, I could not but believe that every man and woman that came into this kingdom was as pure as an angel. Herein I was mortally deceived. When I received the gospel, I put up my books. I laid them aside. I did not expect to charge another particle of labor for anything I should do. I calculated to live with the church and had not the least idea that book accounts were needed in this church. I calculated that every man would do everything necessary to do for themselves, and something more, and handed in to send the gospel, gather up the poor saints, learn to them how to get their living and how to do for themselves, and no one should say aught that they possessed. I found myself mistaken." Brigham Young was baptized in April 1832. That fall he went to Kirtland, Ohio, to meet the prophet Joseph Smith for the first time. On his way, he visited with a minister, a friend, who was greatly opposed to Joseph Smith. Quote, "I recollect when I was going to see the brethren for the first time, one of my Methodist friends, I do not know whether Methodist or not, but he was a preacher. I recollect calling on him. He began to tell me what old Joseph Smith had done, that himself had done this, that, and the other thing. What power did he do it by? By the power of the devil. He said that Joseph Smith was one of the wickedest men to ever live. Says I, hold on a little, let me talk. Joseph Smith I have never seen, to my knowledge, though I have always lived close by him. And the revelations that the Lord has revealed through him is the same as he revealed to his ancient prophets and apostles, and by his Son, Jesus Christ. I have taken the rule laid down there and in the late revelations to know whether they are true or not. I thought, if they are true, the Lord will tell me. He will answer me. He will reveal it to me. Go to the Father in the name of Jesus Christ, and all these things shall be made known. Now, says I do not know anything about Joseph, but the doctrine that has been revealed through him I do know to be the plan of salvation, according to the New and Old Testaments, and the signs God has given me. He may act like the devil for aught I care. I did not call him to be a prophet, deliver the plates of the Book of Mormon, and send Moroni to administer to him. And I had nothing to do with him, and do not care to the last day he lived what he do. It is not my business to call in question an act of his life. He was in the hands of him that called him, and the doctrine and the author could do as he pleased with his servant." End quote. The Lord, Brigham Young said, could do as he pleased with his servant. I think in our society, even in the church, is so quick to judge and condemn that we forget whose place it is to call and to judge those whom he does call. Brigham Young's description of meeting Joseph Smith for the first time is my favorite passage. I've transcribed thousands of pages of shorthand. This is my favorite quote. Quote, "After I was baptized and built quite a number of branches, I had to see the prophet in the fall. I wanted the hand of the prophet in my hand, his eye to look in mine. I wanted to look in his eye, and I wanted to read that man's heart, and I wanted to know for myself and not for another. I saw him and heard him speak. He was chopping in the woods. He stopped and shook hands with us. All right. He put down his axe. I said, I can chop this. So we chopped and loaded a while, and then he said, come, let's go to the house. I knew then for myself and not for another. I wanted to see this man that dictated and led and guided, and the Mormons where they lived together. And then for the world, I defy it to produce any community like this that is governed by words and by words alone. End quote. He gained a firm testimony of Joseph Smith, and he never wavered, ever. Ever. He earnestly sought to learn all he could from Joseph. Quote, when I first saw Joseph, I had but just one prayer, and that was all the time I could hear Joseph and hear his doctrine. I would watch him. I was with him several years before I ever opened my mouth. I was with him when he received revelation, and so was Brother Kimball and others. An angel never watched him closer than I did, and that is what has given me the knowledge that I have today. End quote. Brigham Young traveled on many missions, including one to Canada before he was baptized. He described how he obtained food and lodging while preaching the gospel and traveling. Quote, I have traveled without purse or script as much as any other man in the church. If I was hungry and went to a house, I made known my wants. And by the time I got through eating, they were willing to talk about Mormonism or anything else. If I wanted to stay overnight, I made known my want. I don't recollect of one circumstance, but what I was made welcome and could call again, and was welcome to every table, lodging, and friendship. End quote. He must have been a very engaging and a very pleasant guest. I wish I could have been the proverbial fly on the wall and watched his interactions with those with whom we stayed. The Missouri persecutions. The saints were driven from their homes in Jackson County, Missouri, in the fall of 1833. In 1834, a group of Latter-day Saints called Zion's Camp traveled with Joseph Smith from Kirtland and other places to try and help the saints who had been driven and restore them to their lands. When they returned without fighting and without restoring the Missouri saints to their lands, many considered the venture a failure. Brigham Young later related a conversation he had with one such person. Quote, I recollect in the year 1834 that 205 of us was going up to Jackson County. We did not go into Jackson County. We did not reinstate the brethren. We returned, and the Lord gave Joseph a revelation concerning the matter. I understood it. I recollect when I returned home, the question was asked me by some of the elders. Brother Brigham, what have you gained by your going up to Missouri? Knowledge. What was the advantage of Joseph calling a company together to lead them to Missouri? They have accomplished nothing. Says I to the individual that was talking with me. For the knowledge I have gained, this is the use of my leading the companies, gathering the saints, dealing with myself, overcoming myself, governing and overcoming the spirits of others. For this knowledge I have gained, I would not give it for this town, and then I would add the county of Geauga, and I will add the state of Ohio too, and every person there is in it to be our slaves, and every particle of property to be my own individual property. You did not go, did you? No. No. And there is something that we have gained that you will never learn. End quote. The experience he gained on Zion's Camp, watching Joseph Smith and learning from him how to lead a group of people, became invaluable 4 years later, when Joseph Smith was imprisoned in the Liberty Jail and Brigham Young and the 12 had to direct the saints' removal from Missouri to Illinois. and then again years after that when he had to direct the immigration to the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young described how his father, John Young, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, felt when the Saints were expelled from the state of Missouri in 1838, quote, "My father was a revolutionary soldier. Now says he, I want to live no longer. I have fought for the liberty of my country, but there is no liberty left. No freedom for the inhabitants of the country I have fought for. I want to live no longer," end quote. John Young died in Quincy, Illinois in October 1839. Months before the Saints were driven from Far West and other parts of Missouri in the fall of 1838, Joseph Smith received a revelation on July 8, 1838, in Far West, Missouri, directing the 12 to leave on their mission to England the next spring, which is recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants 118:5, quote, "Let them take leave of my saints in the city of Far West on the 26th day of April next, on the building spot of my house, saith the Lord," end quote. Well, the thought of a mission to England must have sounded daunting in and of itself. None of the saints would have imagined in July 1838 the mobbing and violence they would experience that fall, their expulsion from the state of Missouri, or that Joseph Smith and other church leaders would be imprisoned in Liberty Jail. It was literally life-threatening for a Latter-day Saint to return to Far West, Missouri in 1839, and many said they should not go into Far West as commanded. But as Brigham Young later related, he was determined to follow the Lord's directions and keep his commandments at all costs. Quote, "It was pretty hard in the eyes of many for us to go to Far West at the time we left. There was 9 of us there after ordaining George A. and another. Some of our brethren said we should not live to go there. I said we should and come back, and one thing was certain, if we didn't live to go, we should die trying, that we should fulfill all the Lord has spoken. They had said far and near that this was one revelation that could not be fulfilled. The revelation was given on the 8th of July and was published in the Elders' Journal and went forth among the people. And they cried that that revelation could never be fulfilled, but it was. And we went on our way rejoicing," end quote. They arrived in Far West after midnight on the appointed day, sang, prayed, ordained George A. Smith and Wilford Woodruff as apostles, symbolically started their mission, though they were not able to leave for some weeks, and went on their way rejoicing. They fulfilled the commandments of the Lord. On himself. Brigham Young's comments on himself help us see him as he saw himself, and as he really was. He said he didn't care what others thought of him, quote, "I am that independent. I never lose a moment's sleep reflecting whether people love me or not. It never takes away my appetite. I never hate anyone so as to take away my appetite, or love anyone so as to do it. But I delight in doing good, keeping the commandments of the Lord, and building up his kingdom, and it is my chief and only joy," end quote. He loved music. His singing voice was one of the comforts on Zion's camp. He supported the Tabernacle Choir, but he would scold them for not following the director. He really scolded them. Once he invited a choir from a small Utah town to Salt Lake City to show the Tabernacle Choir how to sing and how to follow their conductor. He worried about the discomfort of people sitting on the hard benches in the old tabernacle. Quote, "We ought to have this tabernacle filled with sofas and have it large enough for every man and woman to lie down and sing psalms until we sing ourselves to sleep. I ought to have a room to myself, and if I wished in myself, sit and sing myself to everlasting bliss," end quote. He would have loved the conference center with its soft seats. Brigham Young on himself as a prophet and about his prophetic ministry. After Joseph Smith's death, Brigham Young and the 12 took their proper place at the leadership of the church. As Brigham Young later said, quote, When I heard of the death of Joseph, my thought was, what will become of the people? What will the saints do? The prophet is gone. It was my whole desire to preserve the sheep, the flock of God. This was my desire and my whole desire, and it is so today. What can we do to preserve the flock of God?" End quote. But there were others who also laid claim to the leadership of the church. When Joseph and Hiram Smith were killed, most of the 12 were away on missions sent by Joseph Smith. Sidney Rigdon arrived in Nauvoo, Illinois on August 3rd, 1844, before most of the 12, and immediately pressed his claim to leadership of the church. Brigham Young and 4 other members of the 12 arrived in the evening of August 6th. Sidney Rigdon had called a meeting of the saints for August 8th, 1844, 180 years ago today, at which he spoke about the future of the church. Brigham Young later recalled his response to Sidney Rigdon's words, quote, "I do think I am a good hand to keep dogs out of the flock. When Sidney Rigdon was saying he should become the church guardian, I went there alone. And pretty soon Kimball came, and Brother Woodruff, this, that, and the other, and filled up the stand. And Sidney took his place on the wagon. I thought, my good fellow, if I do not hunt you until you are out of this flock of sheep, I am mistaken. That is the way I feel to this day." End quote. Brigham Young knew he was called of God, quote, "The Lord in his providence called me to where I am. It is not my own doing, and it is through the providence of God, and I know how to build up the kingdom." End quote. He applied the same standard to himself that he did to Joseph Smith about the Lord calling his prophets, quote, "I am naturally as tempted as any other man. As to the complaint many make of want of education, there is not a man in this stand that can tell a harder story with regard to backwoods and hard fare. I know how to cut down hemlock trees, beech, maple, basswood. I know how to clear off farms. I knew it in my youth, learned it as a trade, hard fare. What I aim to say is, God calls me to this duty. It is none of my business whether I am capable or not. If he doesn't give me anything to say to the people, I sit down and hold my tongue." End quote. Many church members questioned then and later why Brigham Young did not write Revelations like Joseph Smith did. Brigham Young brought this up on occasion, quote, "Many whined that Brother Brigham does not have revelations. Why, bless your souls, hearts, or gizzards, I could not speak or exist one day without living in the light of revelation. People asked me, why do you not write your revelations? Because it would damn the people. And when a revelation is given, if they do not abide it, it would keep people from the church. I speak the words of the Lord to the people without writing a revelation and saying, thus saith the Lord. It is to spare the weak and feeble and the ignorant." End quote. He said that if he wrote a revelation and it was accepted by the people, those who did not obey would be under condemnation. Therefore, he did not write revelations. Section 136 is the only revelation given to Brigham Young that is in the Doctrine and Covenants. Though he did not write revelations as Joseph Smith did, Brigham Young said that revelation was essential to him to live and lead. Quote, "I don't know how a saint can get along without the revelations of the Spirit of the Lord day by day. I don't. I cannot accomplish any business transactions and know how to conduct myself before my family, before my neighbors, and do my work, to be prepared to accomplish the work here upon the earth that is assigned to me to do manfully, nobly, and acceptably to God. I don't see how a person can get along without the revelations of the Lord Jesus." End quote. He sought to learn and then follow the mind of the will of the Lord, as he told the Salt Lake City School of the Prophets in May 1868, quote, I have an experience in these things, and it is this. In the first place, to learn the mind and the will of God, then bring my will and mind and love and affection directly to that line. To do the things the Lord wants done and requires of me. That is what I wish to do. I wish to do nothing else but the will of God. I know just as well how to direct this people, how to sustain themselves to become wealthy and wise, as I know the road home. God has given this to me and filled me with everything I know, place and time, and it is plain to me how to dictate the people. There is no goodness in me more than others, only I am here. I am here, and I only desire to do the best I can and lead this people to victory and glory, the Lord being my helper, and he does help me all the time. End quote. In conclusion, when we hear Brigham Young as he spoke, in his own words, according to the shorthand record, which is the closest we have, sound recording came in decades later, we hear a very different man than the one that is so often criticized. Brigham bashing has become a sport in the church, criticizing for his words or parts of his teachings, often without correct information or considering the times in which he lived. Yes, he said things that I and many others wished he had not said, but I have said many things I wish I had not said. And I suppose every person here has also. We just don't have shorthand reporters following us around, thankfully. We as a people need to re-examine what we believe and say about Brigham Young based on correct understanding and based on correct sources. He was a complex person and lived in complex times. He thought deeply and shared his thoughts. He led the church through many perilous times. He organized the first immigration to Salt Lake City and tried every means, including handcarts, to bring the saints to Utah, even though he knew many, if not the majority, would not stay faithful. He was a brilliant organizer. He sought the Lord and his gospel long before he found the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when he found the truth, he studied it intensely and then believed, and believing never wavered. He learned for himself of the divinity of Joseph Smith's call, as he said, I knew then for myself and not for another. He lived according to what he knew. When hard times came and difficult teachings, he studied and prayed and pondered until he could understand, but he always remained faithful to Joseph Smith, to his teachings and revelations, to the gospel, to the church, and to the Lord. Thank you.
We have some questions here, and so I'm going to ask them and let her respond to this. The first one is, what is your view on the theory that Brigham had Joseph Smith killed?
It is absolute, total, utter nonsense. I have in my life experienced a tremendous amount of personal slander, some of it ugly. That has made me fierce in seeking truth and depending on the truth. I have personally transcribed George D. Watt's shorthand notes taken in the courtroom when men were tried for the murder of Joseph Smith. There are 2 other sets of longhand notes that I have also read. If any group had any interest in promoting that theory, it would have been those men on trial for murder. There isn't a hint of it. That's utter nonsense. It's easy to make up stories and throw stones. I know.
So regarding your shorthand research, are there lots of records in shorthand that need to be translated still? And are there many people with this skill? And what has that work been like?
I'm solo. I've taught some brilliant people to read shorthand. I've got this wacky brain. I can't drive. I goof up all sorts of things, but I can read shorthand. It's my calling and my gift. I have transcribed almost everything we have said by Brigham Young and everything we have by John Taylor, and working on Wilford Riddiff and others. There will be some left. I'm 72. I'll work still for several years, I hope. But maybe. I have some hope on my daughter.
Okay. Okay, kind of multi-part. What have you learned about Brigham's views on slavery, and did that feed into the priesthood ban, or another part, did you find anything related to Brigham Young and the priesthood ban while you're doing your shorthand transcription?
Yes. I am co-author with U of U history professor Paul Reeve, attorney and PhD history student Christopher Rich, on the start of the priesthood ban. In 1852, the Utah Territorial Legislature was debating slavery. Some Southern church members had brought slaves into Utah Territory, and there needed to be some laws passed. In the midst of this debate, Brigham Young said they can't hold a priesthood. Now, in one note on one other meeting, this is stated before, but this is the first record of anybody stating it verbatim. But it was obvious from the debate that everybody knew it. Now, the book will be published by Oxford in October. In the lunchroom and where the book sale is, there's flyers with 30% discount code for pre-orders from Oxford. I'm not trying to sell the book. That's not my job here. But if you're going to buy the book, there's a discount.
I am. I'm trying to sell anything out of the bookstore, so go ahead.
No, it's just a flyer, but I'm sure you'll carry it. It's called This Abominable Slavery. And during the same debate, however, Brigham Young and Orson Pratt went like this. One of my first duties when I get over there is, one of my first questions is find those two and ask how they ever made up. I made up an answer. This is pure me. I made up an answer one day that they'll say, well, we found out who was right and the other one apologized. That's pure conjecture. But Orson Pratt got up and gave a vehement anti-slavery speech. No hint had ever survived out of the shorthand. He said to enslave the African because his skin differs in color from ours is enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. And I agree with him.
Okay, another hard one. Has your research ever added insight to Brigham Young's comments on the Adam God theory?
Brigham Young said once, let doctrine alone you don't understand. When it comes to Adam God, I say thank you, Brigham. Yes, the big first talk he gave on April 9th, I think it is 1852, the shorthand doesn't exist. He did teach it. I personally don't understand it. So I follow his advice and let doctrine alone I don't understand. But there are some teachings of it and things that I have transcribed.
Okay, so where would be the best place for me if I was looking for stuff on Brigham Young? Where should I look?
Matthew Groh, the director of the Church History Library, is writing a biography of Brigham Young. He's a very, very, very busy man. That will be the biography to read on Brigham Young. If you want to read his words, go to the Church History Library catalog and look in collection CR 100-912. Or else you can just put my name in the search box. And there is literally thousands of pages of Brigham Young's words that I've transcribed. Wait for Matt Groh's biography. That's going to be the one to read.
Excellent. So what have you learned about Brigham Young's character that is most applicable to young members of the church? And what about him should young people strive to emulate?
His intense desire to find the truth and follow it. He searched out every church he could find anything about, trying to find a church that followed the Bible. You know, when he met Joseph Smith, the quote I read, he says, I knew for myself and not for another. We must all seek and find the truth for ourselves, but be careful you are searching from the truth. There is so much nonsense and garbage out there purporting to be the truth. Check citations. Be careful. Be careful of sources. Study his words. But he was a good man. He was a caring man. He was a loving man. People say, well, why would anybody follow Brigham Young? Well, they came to Utah, wrote home to their friends and family, and they came. And they wrote home to their friends and family, and they came. And yes, some left. But we don't know Brigham Young. I mean, he said he could stop at any house he wanted, and he'd be invited back. I mean, he was very different than the caricature that's grown up in the church about him.
So, again, a two-part. Do you have a favorite story about Brigham Young that most people don't know? And then, is there anything that you see that's misquoted about him a lot? Or misstated?
The Journal of Discourses is misquoted.
Okay.
Period. Favorite story? Got a lot of them. In Nauvoo, there was 2 ordinances before the city council that hogs had to be fenced and dogs had to be tied up. And Hiram was against this. And Joseph was loyal to Hiram. And Brigham went to Joseph and he says, Joseph, I don't want to vote against you, but the hogs are eating the widow's garden and the dogs are biting the children. And Joseph said, vote against me, it'll do me good. And so they voted. Joseph and Hiram voted against the ordinance, and the rest of the 12 voted. Brigham said, we voted the hogs into pens and the dogs tied up.
Is there a way to help fund the training of more or younger folks to read the shorthand?
When I was in college, a roommate looked at me, and she says, LaJean, you're an odd mixture of patience and impatience. She was right on. And I'm coming to see I'm an odd mixture of some exceptional competencies and some very exceptional incompetencies. I'll write a letter and date it 1852. There's a memo in the church archives dated 1866. I wasn't being funny. I've got a wacky brain. It's nonlinear. I can't drive. And this is my calling. And I don't, that's all I can say. I've taught brilliant people. But it's not learning to read the shorthand, it's learning to read the nuances in the shorthand. I was reading something recently and it said, it was written short I, S, short I. The word was committee. Now, how did I know that? Because the S was a little like this, it was like this, and they'd use the word committee a lot, and I knew how the person wrote, and that's what my mind does. So funding isn't going to help. I hope my daughter, she's got my brain.
Hope so. So in your research of Brigham Young, what character or personality flaw do you notice was most troublesome to him, something that concerned him that he sought to change about himself, perhaps thorn in the flesh, so to speak?
His temper, his tongue. He was very aware of his tongue. And I recently read a passage, I don't have it with me, but I read a passage about his efforts to control his temper. He said, if you see me just standing there, I will be quiet until I can say something. But one thing not known about Brigham Young is he scolded the men far worse than the women. He's got a reputation for being hard on women, but he was decades ahead of himself in women. He wanted them trained in business. He wanted them in the telegraph office. He wanted them running the stores. And once he was talking about waste, and he was scolding the women for waste, and he says, now you men, you're 10 times worse, or you're much worse. He wasn't as hard on women as his reputation was.
I have a couple of questions here you may not know the answer to. It has to do with, what do you think about AI transcribing shorthand, and is that something that could be incorporated?
I have a new student who responded to my fair presentation last year. He works in AI for Google. He thought it could. He's convinced. If he isn't, he hasn't seen David Evans' shorthand yet. Shorthand is very condensed speech. It is cryptic. The same symbol can have multiple meanings. And when it's clearly written, it's hard to read. And when it's not clearly written, I just have to sit there and stare about it and let something run on my head. I do this very prayerfully. No, there's too much ambiguity. AI my son says, is brilliant in finding patterns, but it's no good in ambiguity. And the shorthand is just absolutely full of ambiguity.
I appreciate your time and your efforts and your lifelong project in doing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.